Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marc Stier. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Policy Center. We're here today to talk about material that's in a report that we are releasing today. The subject of the report is the coming fiscal crisis in Pennsylvania and what to do about it. We'll also talk for a few minutes about why it exists, I think, because that's something is not widely understood. So let me start off this way. There have been some major achievements in recent years in the General Assembly. A lot of them cost money. 2 years of $500 million plus adequacy funding and tax equity funding, a new tax credit for working families, an expanded tax credit for child care and dependent care, an expanded tax credit to relieve property taxes for seniors. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Um, Healthcare reforms that expanded eligibility for discounted drugs, new investments in childcare and affordable housing, and new efforts to help businesses expand in the state. If you look at why it happened, there are a couple of reasons. One is we had strong leadership from the governor, from the Democratic House majority, and from Senate Democrats who, despite being in the minority, have had an impact on these budgets that should not be ignored. Um, Efforts of advocacy organizations like our own Pennsylvanians Together campaign. But finally, a huge surplus made it possible to spend much more in some cases, without raising taxes, and thus to spend more, to take away the major objection to these policies that Republicans who still control the Senate would have raised if we didn't have the surplus. I very much doubt we would have gotten over $1 billion in adequacy funding or these new tax credits unless we had money in the bank that could pay for them. The problem, however, is we're looking to the future of not surpluses but deficits. Um, this is a very simplified table looking at projections of the Pennsylvania budget. You'll see that since 24-25, the current year balance, which is current year revenues minus current year expenditures, has been in deficit. In 24-25, it was $2.5 billion. Our estimate for the current fiscal year 25-26 is that we're going to have a $4.6 billion deficit, and it's going to keep going up and up. Drops a little bit but in 2028-29, but only drops to about $7 billion. And if you look at the bottom line, that's the accumulated surplus. At the start of last fiscal year, we had $11 billion surplus. At the start of the current fiscal year, we had a $7.5 billion surplus. That includes the general fund surplus and the rainy day fund. Right now, we pretty much all we have is the day fund. The general fund surplus at the end of the current year will be zero. But if you look at 26-27, we run down most of the surplus because we're projecting a $6.5 billion current year deficit in 26-27. And then by 27-28, if we were to spend all the money, we would have not a surplus, but a deficit of $6.3 billion. This is very serious stuff. We all know that in the 8 years before the COVID pandemic, the state would often start the year with a $1 to $3 billion deficit, and the General Assembly and the governor would have to work together to raise some revenues, and often to use gimmicks like underestimating Medicaid caseloads, and shifting money back and forth from one year to another, shifting money from special funds to the general fund in order to balance the budget. By the time we get to 26-27 and 27-28, when there's no more surplus, we have about a $7 billion deficit. That's not something that can be easily fixed or papered over by budget gimmicks or other kinds of things like that. And these budget projections do not include the commitment the state has made to fully and fairly fund education. In the last 2 years, we've added $500 million to the budget for adequacy funding. This table shows what happens if we keep adding $500 million each additional year, which is the plan that was adopted with bipartisan support, I should add, by the General Assembly last year. So you add $500 million to the 26-27 budget, now you're talking about a $7 billion deficit. Add $1 billion to 27-28, you're talking about an $8.3 billion deficit. If you look at 28-29, if we keep adding $500 million a year, it's $1.5 billion in addition. And now we have a $9.2 billion deficit. These are very, very serious issues and a very, very serious problem. Um, I'm going to just talk a little bit about uh, the situation, what we've learned. As I said, the structural deficit is not new. We've been dealing with it for a long time. And one of the lessons of that experience is it's very, very hard to deal with it because Democrats rightly resist cutting spending and Republicans wrongly resist raising taxes. And so that those are the two ways you close the deficit, and it's not going to be very easy to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who's going to talk about some of the sources of our structural deficit.
Okay,
I should
so
say, I should say Laura Beltran Figueroa, the research director at Pennsylvania Policy. I'm sorry.
yes, thank you, Mark, for that. So how did we get here? In 2022, we have that Act 53 cut the corporate net income tax rate from 9.99% to 8.99% in 2023, with plans to bring it down to 4.99% in 2031. What this is going to cause or has caused is 915 million loss in revenue in the 2024 fiscal year, 2.7 billion by 2030, 2031, and possible additional 500 million if tax cuts are accelerated. And before this administration, we also had the Rendell and Corbett administration, where Pennsylvania gradually phased out the capital stock and franchise tax and adopted other corporate tax rates. And it was partly because of these decisions that we saw the state losing billions of dollars a year in revenue by the late 2010s, further fueling the structural deficit we are seeing today and that Mark has previously mentioned. And then a little bit as just like how we can see this chart basically shows the corporate taxes have been providing a smaller share of the general fund revenue over time. So by 1972 and 1973, we saw that this was roughly 30% of where our revenue came from. And then fast forward to 2022 and 2023, we're down to 16%, roughly a 50% reduction in what the corporations are contributing to our general fund. And when we ask this, we need to look at how our tax system is set up. And one of the biggest and hardest explanations is talking about the uniformity clause. So when we refer to the uniformity clause is this rule in our state constitution that basically says that each class of taxpayers has to be taxed at a uniform rate, which courts have interpreted to mean that we cannot have higher income tax rates on millionaires than on low wage workers or different rates for different brackets. However, this need not be the case. And actually, we have a couple of reports that show potential options to kind of work around the uniformity clause to effectively tax different individuals. And just kind of as to provide a little bit more background, we see that Pennsylvania won't raise enough revenue if the richest Pennsylvanians are not paying their fair share. So we have that the lowest 20% of Pennsylvanians are roughly paying 15.1% of total taxes as a share of their family income, while the top 1% is only paying 6.0%. I don't think I need to explain why this is extremely troublesome when people earning over $750,000 a year are only paying 6% in taxes, while those earning less than $22,000 or $22,100 are paying 15% of their income. And then the issue is not that Pennsylvania spends too much. We're not, compared to other states, we only rank 18th in terms of state and local expenditures. We're pretty much a middle of the road state. And this is not even taking into account our aging population and thus the higher share that goes in terms of Medicaid spending and also our declining infrastructure and our high spending that comes with highways and other infrastructure projects. If we were to spend the average amount for both the other states do, we would see that our state's ranking actually falls even further from 18th nationally to 26th. So the issue is, can we cut our way out? And this is kind of a little bit of what Mark was saying at the beginning of the presentation. So we know that what can be cut, that it's mandatory spending. Basically, it's going to be pension contributions, debt service, paying our interest in our loans, wages for most government operations, and then the state share of Medicaid or SNAP. And that's not even taking into account all the federal cuts that are coming our way, and additional expenses that we're probably going to be seeing in our budget. So what can be cut? K through 12 schools and school fundings, we already agreed on adequacy funding to meet the gap to provide a good education for all Pennsylvania children, regardless of their school district and when they live. Higher education, out of which we already have the highest or among the highest tuition rates in the state, making it extremely unaffordable for thousands of younger individuals to access higher educations, and human services.
And I would just add, those are the things that were cut by Tom Corbett in 2011 because there was no other way to close that budget deficit then. And these are the only things that could be cut if we tried to cut our way. Frankly, you can't save $7 billion by making cuts in these three areas. It would be devastating. People in Pennsylvania would not accept it any more than they accepted Tom Corbett's cuts in 2011.
So when we talk about the affordability deficit, and I've kind of gone a little bit over this, we're still seeing a lot of issues that our residents are experiencing. So first, we have extremely high in-state tuition and fees, which are 66% higher than the national average for four-year colleges and roughly 58% higher for two-year colleges. In terms of childcare and pre-K education, we also are below a lot of where we won't want to be in compared to other states. Only 19% of 3- and 4-year-olds are enrolled in state-funded pre-K programs, below the 25% average of surrounding states and 21% of the national average. And we see that the cost of childcare is extremely unaffordable for several families, with being 10 to 20% higher than national averages and expenses reaching $13,000 through $16,000 a year per child, also complicating the decision of a lot of working families to have children and be able to live a comfortable life. And then in terms of housing, we have that 39% of renters spend more than 35% of their household income in housing, making it an extremely burdensome expense. And home ownership is increasingly out of reach for first-time home buyers, younger individuals in particular. So we still see that it's an extreme need to provide funding for these services. And also in terms of K through 12 education, although we have the Supreme Court decision in 2022 providing adequacy funding for schools, our state share is still slightly below of the national average, standing at 37%, and the national average roughly at 44%. And then just lastly, in terms of infrastructure, as I mentioned, we still have a very outdated system in terms of our roads and bridges, and actually the American Society of Civil Engineers gave Pennsylvania a grade of C-, and actually a grade of D or D- in terms of our wastewater system management. So there is continuous need for improvements there.
And I'll just add the one tax we have been raising in Pennsylvania over the last 10 years, certainly in the 20 years I've lived here, the pothole tax gets more expensive every year because of the bad. All of us have to spend a lot more money fixing the suspensions of our cars and things like that. So what have we seen? We're facing enormous deficits, current year deficits just a year and a half from now. The problem's not we overspend. We spend about average for most states. We still have many needs that are not met. And our tax system is horribly upside down. And there's that old joke, Willie Sutton said, "Why do you rob banks?" And he answered, because that's where the money is. Well, why do states with balanced budgets tax wealthy people and corporations? Because that's where the money is. But we haven't been doing that in this state. And that is the major reason we're seeing these projected deficits that are enormously large. So how do we fix the problem? Obviously, we're going to have to get more revenue. If you look back again at this chart, it simply is unfair and unproductive even to raise a lot of revenue from low and middle income people. So we have to look for some ways to raise revenue from higher income people. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Chris Rabb, who's going to talk about one tax option that we've been talking about for a number of years, the fair share tax.
Thank you, Mark. I'm State Representative Chris Rabb. I represent the 200th Legislative District of Pennsylvania, covering 4 neighborhoods and 70,000 people in Northwest Philadelphia. And I'm a fifth-term state representative and will be introducing for the fifth time the Fair Share Tax Plan. I was happy to join Senator Haywood in my first term in office. And it's evolved somewhat, but the bottom line is we believe that money made on money should be taxed at a higher rate than money based on labor and sweat equity in one's own business. What that looks like is the personal income tax is currently 3.07%. We believe that working families should get a reduction in personal income tax and make the ultra rich pay their fair share. So it's essentially bifurcating the personal income tax based on tax on income from work versus those folks who have wealth and generate income based on passive income. Most folks do not have passive income. It's pretty much just wages and salary and such. And so this opens up an extraordinary opportunity to generate billions of extra tax revenue every year. And this obviously would be something that would allow us to have a policy that's based in tax fairness, that reverts this, how would you call it, this upside down system that we have now, where working families pay a larger percentage of their take home than the wealthiest Pennsylvanians. And that's essentially the secret sauce of the Fair Share Tax Plan.
Thanks, Representative Rabb. And I'll just point out one last thing. We adopt this plan, the taxes on the top 1% in Pennsylvania would still be lower than any state around us. We're not soaking the rich, we're just sprinkling the rich a little bit and trying to raise revenue by doing that. Second idea we've been talking about is corporate tax reform, and I want to introduce Representative Elizabeth Fiedler from Philadelphia, who's been championing this idea for some time.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to Rep. Rabb, who preceded me, and all of my colleagues who are on here. I am excited that this energy is growing for tax reform in the Commonwealth. 73% of the corporations that are active in our state pay no corporate taxes to the Commonwealth at all because of what's called the Delaware loophole, which I know many people have heard about. And it's essentially hiding their profits from us, from you all as taxpayers. You pay your taxes, we pay our taxes, and yet these almost 3/4 of the corporations that do business here are not making those investments. These are not small mom and pop stores. These are not local businesses. These are mega corporations. These are some of the biggest corporations you've heard of, names you would certainly know: pharmaceutical companies, energy companies, insurance companies. These are folks who are doing business here in Pennsylvania. They are making tremendous profits off of Pennsylvanians, and they are using our infrastructure. And so, glad for them to do business here, just asking them to invest in our Commonwealth in the same way that all of us do, just by paying taxes. So the combined reporting bill was introduced this year in the tax reform package. It's House Bill 1610. And it really just requires that all companies operating here in the Commonwealth report to the Commonwealth. If a national company does 25% of its goods and services, sells them here in PA, then we think it should pay Pennsylvania taxes on that same 25%. So it really seems like common sense to me. We know that I think it's 28 other states already have combined reporting. So we do not buy the line that this would scare folks away, or that this is, a poison pill, as was said. This is common sense. People are paying their taxes. They're just asking that some of these huge multinational corporations join us in paying their taxes. And then we can spend all that money and invest it on the things that we care about in our budget: mass transit, education, all the priorities that you'll hear about even more. So that is combined reporting. Sounds like maybe a complicated name, but it really just means having everybody, the big multinational corporations, pay their fair share, just as we do. And I should say it passed the House for the first time this year, but did not, unfortunately, become part of a larger budget deal. So we are keeping hope alive, and we'll keep working on that. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Representative Fiedler. And I'm just going to point out it would create a level playing field for Pennsylvania corporations. Your locally owned coffee shop pays Pennsylvania taxes. They pay for the education of their employees. They pay for the roads and bridges you travel to get there. Starbucks, on the other hand, their headquarters is in the Cayman Islands. They don't pay taxes to Pennsylvania, and yet they get the same benefits that your local coffee shop does. So this is about, not just about taxing the wealthy, it's also about creating a level playing field for Pennsylvania businesses. Third thing we're going to talk about is the severance tax, and we're going to start with Senator Haywood, who's been on many of these tax proposals. He could have probably talked about lots of them, but he's been one of the chief sponsors of the severance tax, and so I'm going to turn it over to him, and followed by Representative Tarik Khan and Chris Pielli, who've also been presenting a severance tax in the House. Senator Haywood?
Thank you so much, Mark, and for all my colleagues who are providing leadership on these critical issues. Pennsylvania is a rich state, and our General Assembly, unfortunately, has decided that relief would be provided to rich people and rich corporations for the taxes that make our state work, not so much for everyday people. So I see it that we are facing a defunding cliff. And I call it a defunding cliff because, as Mark has clearly set forth, if we don't have the revenue, then we will be in a position of cutting K-12, cutting higher education, cutting childcare, cutting healthcare, cutting critical government services to our citizens. Now, we can avoid this defunding cliff with the many solutions that are being provided today. And these are not radical solutions. Many of them exist in other states in the nation. One of them is taxing natural gas. I'm on the committee called the Legislative Budget and Finance Committee, and we got a report in 2024 that said Texas is taxing natural gas at a much higher rate than Pennsylvania. Let me be more clear. The report said Pennsylvania is the second largest producer of natural gas, only behind Texas, in the United States. We are called the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. Now, we are producing about 66% of what's being produced in Texas. But listen to this. Texas is collecting $12 billion in the last 5 years from these severance tax. Pennsylvania, $1.1 billion. Let me say it again. In the last 5 years, Texas, $12 billion in severance tax. Pennsylvania, $1.1 billion. So this is a tremendous discrepancy. They're getting 66%. We're producing, as I said, 66% of the natural gas of Texas. Yet we're only getting like 9% of the revenue. Why are we doing what we are doing and not following Texas? Now, in the beginning, when the natural gas industry started, we said we would just have a low tax rate for them before the industry got mature so they could get settled in. It's been over 10 years. The industry is mature. They know what they are doing, and they know that they are getting a tax rate dramatically less than our competitors. And so the severance tax is basically to tax the natural gas producers, one industry in this state that is, as I have said before, and I'll say again, fracking freeloaders. These are companies that are freeloading on Pennsylvanians. This tax will be paid by customers around the nation, not just Pennsylvanians, because the natural gas is going throughout the nation. And these companies are largely based outside of Pennsylvania. And so that's the core of the severance tax, so that this industry, which has been put in an extremely favorable position, can now, after getting their footing, pay a fair share of taxation. That's the severance tax proposal. Thank you, Mark, for allowing me to present it.
Thanks, Senator Haywood. And now we're going to turn the floor over to Representative Chris Pielli, who's the House sponsor of severance tax, and Representative Tarik Khan, who's I think a co-sponsor of that as well.
Thank you so much, Mark. And before I begin, I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to speak about the gas severance tax legislation. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this press conference, the PA Policy Center, for giving us an opportunity to do something often neglected in politics, and that's trying to get ahead of a crisis before it's too late. We've heard it from several people already. The bottom line is we have to increase our revenue streams. And a good example, as the good senator said, is Pennsylvania's lucrative natural gas industry. Right beneath our feet is the Marcellus Shale Formation, one of the most abundant, easily accessible concentrations of natural gas on Earth. This has allowed Pennsylvania to become the second largest producer of natural gas in the entire country, only behind Texas. And it does bring economic growth and enables us to help power our state and others, has that potential, but it also brings detriment. The consequences of drilling techniques and pollution have damaged our environment and our communities to an extent. I've witnessed this firsthand in my county with the Sunoco, now Energy Transfer, Mariner Pipeline project. There's other areas like Dimock, Pennsylvania's. It's these adversely impacted people who most deserve to benefit from the immense wealth generated by this industry. And unfortunately, we've largely failed them with this ridiculous impact fee. These gas companies make billion-dollar profits. They utilize our natural resource and our state's lands for drilling operations. All of this while past court decisions have been very friendly to them. For example, Sunoco Energy Transfer was deemed a public utility, even though they really are not a public utility. They purchased a public utility certificate years ago from a defunct company, I believe it was Arco. They've had a great run, very successful with their profits, because we do not charge a severance tax on production, and we have lost billions of dollars in revenue. In fact, a 2023 Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center paper estimated that Pennsylvania's lost $3.6 billion in revenues that might have been realized by a modest severance tax of 5% in the previous dozen years. And just give some context to that, Texas, I believe, taxes at a 7.5% rate. And, we get pushback from this. We hear that severance tax is socialism, it's tree-hugging environmentalism. Well, it's really big in drill baby drill Texas. It's a common sense pro-growth policy that requires those who have benefited the most from our natural resources to stop being subsidized at the expense of working Pennsylvanians and require them to finally pay their fair share. That's why Representative Khan and I have introduced legislation. I introduced it last session, and we're dedicated to keep introducing it till it pass. It's a per volume severance tax, just like they have in Ohio and Louisiana, and as I mentioned, Texas. And speaking of Texas, let's compare Texas and Pennsylvania. Although we both lead the nation in natural gas production, there is an almost criminal contrast in the amount of revenue each state generates from production. On average, Texas collected billions of dollars each year in severance tax revenue, $2.13 billion in 2024 alone. In the banner year of 2022, it's a big production year, Texas brought in over $4 billion in revenue. We were only 2% less in production in 2022 from Texas, and yet we only received an estimated $275 million. In fact, we only average about $200 million in revenue each year from our existing per well impact fee. Now, it may be true that everything in Texas is bigger, but their gas production is not so immense that they should be making about 10 times our revenue each year. This is nothing short of financial malpractice for Pennsylvania taxpayers. And this money could be going to our schools, towards chronically underfunded public transportation, to seniors, to renters, etc. It would provide incredible possibilities for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So with that said, I've spoken for quite a while. I want to give my colleague, Representative Tarik Khan, a chance to weigh in on this issue.
Thanks, Rep. Pielli. Thanks. to Marc and the Policy Center. And thanks, Senator Haywood, for leading this in the Senate. I'll be very brief. I want to talk about just sort of my perspective as a healthcare provider and also as a legislator. I can tell you what I'm hearing from my patients, what I'm hearing from nurses and other healthcare workers that I'm working with is that they're feeling squeezed. They're feeling like they have to really bear the brunt of this affordability crisis. They're paying their fair share. They're paying more and more, but they're seeing corporations get off left and right. We're seeing tariffs that are just killing small businesses and people. We are bearing the brunt of that. People, it's my patients. It's the people at the health center. It's the people in my community, the people that I serve. They're bearing the brunt of it. And we're seeing bad policy from coming at left and right from Washington with tariffs, cutting forgiveness of student debt, and really letting corporations and billionaires just have a carte blanche, get away with whatever they want, while the working class, while everyday people are paying the brunt. The severance tax that's being led by Senator Haywood and Representative Pielli and I are introducing in the House is an effort to start to make sure that corporations are paying their fair share. What we're asking for is not radical. In fact, it is in line with every single other gas-producing state in the nation. Every single gas-producing state in the nation.
I think we might have lost Representative Khan, but just to follow up on what he's saying, yes, it's true.
Tax, because that was a high energy year. We would have got $1.7 billion in revenue in that 1 year alone. So we have to start doing things that make sense. And people are getting really fed up that we're not getting the same deal as corporations and the people that are using our resources in Pennsylvania. So this is one of the ways that it's going to bring fairness to make sure that we're able to fund more equitably our schools, making sure we're funding our bridges. And let's not forget our environment. We have thousands of oil and gas wells all across Pennsylvania that are uncapped, and then they're emitting fossil fuels. They're emitting pollution. They're polluting our clean water. They're polluting our air. And this is one of the ways that we can also get some revenue to start capping that and reduce some of the strain from natural gas. So I think this is a common sense measure. I'm really proud to be a part of this. But again, this comes down to fairness and common sense. Thanks a lot. Thanks,
Representative Pielli and Khan. We have one other tax option I want to talk about. We're talking to a number of members of the General Assembly who are going to sponsor this, but we have not identified the one who will take the lead on it yet. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. And that's an intangible wealth tax. We tax wealth in Pennsylvania. The only wealth we tax is real property wealth, which most people have who's not renting. But intangible wealth, for example, investments in stocks and bonds, are mostly held by the richest people. It used to be very hard to tax intangible wealth because people could hide it, but now every brokerage in the country submits reports to the IRS so that the IRS can tax intangible wealth. Pennsylvania can get a hold of those reports. We know who has intangible wealth, and we can figure out easily what they owe in a tax on intangible wealth if we were to set one up. An intangible wealth tax would, if set up properly, would not tax the vast majority of Pennsylvanians. For one thing, a lot of Pennsylvanians have no intangible wealth. For another thing, the kind of intangible wealth that most people do have, such as IRAs and pensions, can be excluded from this tax. Or we could figure out a way to give people a credit for the wealth tax they already pay on property taxes. In fact, we could use some of the wealth tax to reduce property taxes for people whose property taxes are too high. We could raise a huge amount of money with a very, very, very small tax. When you're talking about wealth taxes, you usually talk about mils, not percentage. So a rate of 2 mil, which is 0.002 of someone's intangible wealth, would raise $2 to $3 billion. A 4 mil or 0.004%, 0.004 of your intangible wealth could raise $4 to $5 billion. And if you look at some of the specific examples, you can see that people with only $1 million in wealth would only pay between $2,000 and $4,000. And my guess is if we built in the property tax credit I'm talking about, they wouldn't pay it at all. We probably would not have anyone making with less than $30 million in intangible wealth paying this tax at all, or even having to file a return. But the billionaires, the 50 billionaires, the 100 billionaires, they would pay a lot. Someone with $100 billion in wealth would pay between $200 and $400 million. And if you think $200 to $400 million is a lot of taxes, it's really not that much if you have $100 billion in stocks and bonds and other investment vehicles. So this isn't confiscatory taxation. This is just ensuring that the people who benefited from our side the most, who've either inherited or created great wealth, pay a share of that wealth into supporting the goods and services that Pennsylvania government provides to the people of our state. Finally, let me just, I don't know, would any of the legislators here want to talk about adult use cannabis?
Sure.
Go ahead, Rep. Rabb.
Well, adult use cannabis is something that certainly House Democratic Caucus has supported, and we have moved towards a policy that has been embraced and actually voted out of the House months ago, and will be continuing to advocate for this. It can be a revenue generator. It is something that certainly should be centered on public health and community safety issues, and is also very much like the wealth tax, a reparative social policy, because if done right, the impacts will help address issues around structural inequality that have stained our Commonwealth and our nation for generations. But this absolutely is something that can generate revenue if done right. And of course, the devil's in the details.
Thanks. Anyone else want to add something? I should let you know I was going to ask you this. I totally forgot this morning. Okay. I want to make two more points. One is that we're talking about raising taxes on the ultra rich and on wealthy corporations. These are the very same people who have gotten enormous tax breaks from the federal government in the 2017 and 2025 Trump tax cuts. Our estimate is that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act itself reduced taxes on wealthy people in Pennsylvania by $3.87 billion a year. The 2017 tax cut, we're going to calculate that. We're not absolutely sure, but we think that probably cut taxes on wealthy people in Pennsylvania by another $3 to $4 billion a year. So, and corporations, multinational corporations who we want to pay the worldwide combined reporting version of the corporate net income tax, they've gotten massive tax cuts from the 2017 and 2025 tax laws. Pennsylvania could raise taxes on rich corporations, and all these taxpayers we're going to be taxing more would probably still be paying less taxes now than they did in 2017. So again, we're not trying to confiscate wealth. We're just trying to get the ultra rich and wealthy corporations to pay their fair share of taxation. And if we did all that, assuming that full implementation of all these plans in 2025, we'd be raising another $7.68 billion a year. And of course, there are all kinds of variations. When you're talking about taxes, you could do things at different rates. So we could raise or lower this amount depending on what proposals were adopted. I chose kind of moderate versions of these taxes here to get to $7.68 billion. And if that number $7 billion rings a bell, that's exactly what our deficit is going to be. So we can totally close the deficit and even raise a little bit more money to start providing funds to fix the affordability crisis in Pennsylvania and to provide public goods like education, from which we all benefit. And I'm going to stop the slideshow because that's the end of what we plan to talk about today. And we'll see. Are there any questions? You could either go off mute and ask a question or put something in the chat. Okay. I guess not. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Representatives Pielli and Rabb and Khan and Fiedler and Senator Haywood for being here talking about ideas they've been talking about for a long time and that we're all going to keep talking about, and we're going to have to talk about more as the state runs out of money. This is a chance to really fix what has always been an unfair system, make it fair, and raise the revenue to provide the goods and services that the people of Pennsylvania so desperately need. So thank you all, and have a good day.